Okay. So for the talk this week, for the sermon, I picked the topic of trying to rise to the moment. This is, I'd say, not something that I've got completely worked out in my head. I think sometimes when we give these talks, we've got plans and we know what to do. I certainly know what's on my mind, and I've got some ideas, but I want to have this be something that we discuss a little bit, because I feel like at this point in the United States, we are at a kind of moment. We are at a crucial point where things are going to get frozen. They're going to get fixed. It's going to be hard to change. The next 20, 30, more than that, years are going to be laid out, the shape of them, by the things that happen, I think, in the short term. So let's think a little bit about what those things are. The first is climate change. I think we are at a point on climate change that if we don't do something pretty dramatic soon, we're going to have to do a whole lot if we're going to hope to contain it, manage it, even just limit the biggest problems. So I think we are reaching a point where we can't keep pushing this back. We can't keep saying, well, someday. We can't keep thinking tiny incremental ways. I think we're getting to the point where we have to start doing something. If not, then politics and life and all kinds of things are going to have to be dealing with that. We've seen it here in Shreveport, and around the country recently, right? The heat waves that we've seen come through. It's been hotter here than it's been in June for quite a while, and we haven't been hitting the worst of it. Other parts of the country have been worse. And this comes in the same year when we had a record-setting freeze. You can still see the damage on some of the plants and some of the trees out here from how cold it got, and it's already hot and dry in a way that it shouldn't be yet in June. So we can see some of these effects starting to happen. Something's got to change. When it comes to politics, I think we're at a moment that we're looking at. We've seen drastic efforts by the Republicans to limit voting rights in a lot of ways. That there was a vote recently to try to respond to that and limit that, and it failed. With polarization increasing across different parties and people, not even talking to each other, we're increasingly looking like, I think we're going to see some really extreme kinds of efforts to limit, to undermine, to get rid of democracy as much as possible. And these battles are taking place at all levels. I mean, we've seen arguments that are taking place in the Senate in terms of presidential elections, but you also see them now at school board meetings and at lower levels as well. So I think every part of our government is under siege, and the shape of our democracy, who gets to vote, who has input, who doesn't, how do we listen to each other? I think the next 30 years of what that looks like is getting determined now. We're seeing a lot of wealth centralization. I think that's a big thing that happened during the pandemic. People that had money in the stock market made a pretty good amount of money in that period. And of course, the more you had, the more money that you made. But most people, of course, don't have any money in the stock market. And so they often lost money, were dependent on various kinds of supports to get by, and so on. So we're seeing the gap between the rich and the poor get bigger. And of course, that's a difficult gap to fix. That's a difficult problem to solve, because wealthy people have the power, just in virtue of their wealth, right? They have the power to stop you, to prevent that, to limit it. So there's got to be a tipping point here somewhere, that too much wealth centralizing in one area is going to be awfully hard to push back, and awfully hard to bend it. Last summer, we saw a lot of protests around Black Lives Matter, sort of as the theme, right? And we saw what I really thought was remarkable public awareness and discussion right around the issues of racial justice. This summer is shaping up, though, to be the summer of backlash. There's a lot of discussion about, critical race theory bouncing around. And for all the, parts that they get right and wrong here, what's remarkable is how much energy this backlash has in such a short period of time. It has gone very quickly to be a leading issue that Fox News discusses as a means of backlash, I think, against the movements that we saw last summer get such momentum and such speed. Again, how we talk about this issue is going to be determined fairly soon. I think this one might be a little more fluid, but it's really impressive to me how strong and fervent and quick that backlash has been. Okay, so those are the things that are sort of landing there for me to say, this is a moment. This is a summer that matters. This is going to be a year that matters. This is going to be one that we'll need to remember. All of these problems call for some kind of collective change. That is, it's not just something that I can do for myself. I can't just say, okay, I'll solve climate change or even make a significant contribution. I can't change voting rights on my own. I mean, I can do little things about wealth centralization, but not a whole lot. Even though that I have a fair amount of money in the scheme of things, it's not enough to make a dent in the overall numbers. And the backlash, right, against racial justice, again, I mean, I can take care of myself on that front, but that's not really the nature of the problem. It's not one person. So we need to find ways to rise to this moment, to meet this moment, to make the changes that we need to make. And so I want to think a little bit about how we might do that. One way to do this is to think back, to use history, to go back to other moments when we have faced similar challenges. I think one that's sort of universally popular in American history is World War II, right? This was a case of where the fascists were controlling Europe, and started in Italy and in Germany, and then they had managed to take over most of the continent by that point, by the time the US became involved in it. That the Allies were a significant force for good in terms of what they were able to accomplish. The resistance in France is even, we've even picked up that name, right, to name political movements and talk about the resistance. It's been glorified. If you want to make, sort of a feel-good movie about heroes, if you want enemies, right, World War II is the place that you can go, and you can be sure everybody is going to see it that way. But the stories that we tell about World War II are distorted. That is, they don't bring us the whole picture of what happened, what we saw, or how we would have experienced it, right, if we were living through that moment. So let's talk a little bit about that. For one thing, America's motives were never so pure as they're made out to be, right? In those cases, we boldly stood up to fight the fascists because we saw the threat coming. The truth is, the United States hesitated a lot. Repeatedly argued that it was none of their business, that this war was not important to them. Many people were reluctant to join this war and to join this effort until finally, right, it became almost too late. So another way to tell the story, of course, is we didn't see this threat clearly. We didn't see it just as it was. So the stories, right, give us a clear approach, but life didn't give it that way. A similar sort of thing can be said about our attitudes towards anti-Semitism at the time, right? Now, the Holocaust stands out. Anti-Semitism stands out as a particularly bad form of racism, one that we use as a comparison point when we want to talk about how bad other things are. But prior to World War II, and even in the United States, it was widely accepted, and even widely accepted sort of in polite company and in public. It wasn't just something that was covert. In some ways, we have World War II to thank. We have the Nazis to credit with giving racism a bad name. Prior to that, people would identify as racist. They would adopt that label for themselves. It's not something you just apply to other people. I think we saw coming out of World War II the destructiveness of that kind of divisiveness, the destructiveness of that kind of racism. And we want to imagine that we knew that going in, but we didn't. We perpetrated it. We carried it out. We ignored it. Only, right, when it was staring us in the face did we turn around and respond to it. Last point I want to make about the way we distort this. All of these stories often make the war the dominant feature of everything that they want to talk about. When the truth is, people did a lot of mundane things within that time frame. They went to the grocery store, they went shopping, they got married, they got divorced, probably not as much there, but some. They certainly had all of the kinds of problems and ordinary things that people deal with. Why that's important is I think that's where we tend to live now. This is part of where we lack some of this clarity. We don't spend our times in the grand historical narrative. We spend our days trying to get our houses cleaned up, trying to finish the tasks we'd assigned ourselves, trying to get one thing or another done. It's not so obvious to us what we can do. course, that was the case then too. All right. So what can we do to help rise to this moment? What does thinking about that history in the little thumbnail way that I've offered, and we can certainly talk more about that. What does thinking about that history do to help us think about how we might rise to this moment? Well, one thing I would like to point to is that the complexity actually helps. Thinking about that complexity can help us avoid a mentality that is destructive. Albert Camus wrote this little pamphlet here, and I actually have one of the sort of original versions that was published. Yeah, I think that'll come through. It's all black and white. Would have cost you 25 cents at the time. The title of it is Neither Victims Nor Executioners. That is one of the takeaways Camus got from World War II, is that he neither wanted to be a victim nor an executioner. He did not want to take on this oversimplified vision of the world that he saw going on with the Nazis, and he saw going on with communists, and he saw going on with others that were pushing, sort of capitalism in similar ways, that they were getting these grand ideas that blocked their ability to see the human beings that they were dealing with, the people who were frightened, the people who were scared, the people who were trying to get by in the world in one way or another. He wanted us to be able to see each other as people, right? And avoid being either just a victim or an executioner in response to that. So I think that clarity helps. When we fancy ourselves as fighting the Nazis and just, you got the good guys and the bad guys, it quickly gets easy to demonize the others and to not understand where they're coming from, and to become yourself an executioner, right? To become yourself like that. What else do we need? Well, if things are complicated, we need to start gaining some focus and some clarity. I've noticed that I think people get easily pushed around, easily moved about in the conversations. One of the things social media has made quite easy is the ability to manipulate the public conversation to get us to focus on one thing or another, one moment or another, one issue or another, can just roll right through without us thinking strategically about what's important. Jean-Paul Sartre, writing about arguing with Nazis, reminds us that Nazis like to play with words, is the way he puts it. Like arguing with them is a waste of time, because they'll just play with words. They'll just dance back and forth. They'll duck. They'll get caught in contradictions, and they won't mind, because they're not trying to win the argument. What they need to do is shut down argument, to keep people from thinking and keep people from discussing. Hannah Arendt, who we've discussed before, again, lived through this time period as a refugee, makes a similar point, that what the fascists want is not necessarily somebody who believes what they're saying, but somebody who's given up on the idea of truth, somebody who's just caught up in whatever they're supposed to follow in whatever particular moment. Give an example of how this is working now. So the concept of critical race theory was dropped into the public discourse quite deliberately as an effort to do this. I read recently an analysis of what they were thinking, what Ruffalo and others were thinking when they wanted to do this. What they liked was the name. They didn't care about a thing else about it, but the name. Critical sounded negative. Race was one of those words that triggers people, right? That gets people excited. And theory sounds all kinds of geeky and academic-y and kind of hidden behind things, right? And say, oh, that's perfect. So they latched onto it. Of course, they didn't make up the name. It was already there. But for them, in their public discourse, it was perfect. Because their game now is to get you to say it. It doesn't matter what you say after that. You can say, I support it. You can say, I like it. You can say, you don't understand it. As long as you say those three words, they think they win, right? They think what they've done, right, is reinforce this idea, undermine conversation, scare people, make it seem difficult or strange. What they've done is grab control of the conversation. Rick Santorum recently said, made some stupid comments about the history of the United States, that there was nothing here when the Europeans arrived, or nothing of importance, just sort of obliterating in his mind all of the Native American accomplishments, all the Native American civilization. Of course, these days, I can't help but think he knows what he's doing. That is, we know enough about the history of the United States, and it's spread widely enough to know what he's doing. He's trying to control the conversation. He's trying to get you to respond in anger and frustration and talk about what he wants you to talk about. He's trying to get you to shame those people on the other side so that they then become hostile, and we're talking about him. Recently, there was another senator who was objecting to critical race theory, right? And he said, we need to call an ace an ace. Lots of people point out that's not the phrase, right? Nobody says that. Of course, he knows that, right? He knows that. He's baiting us again. He wants us to argue, right, about words, about these things, talk about this issue. Because if we talk about this issue, what are we not talking about? Climate change, wealth inequality, right? We're not talking about the way a small elite are grabbing power. We're arguing now over whether some historical phrase, right, was said correctly and whether it has racist implications. We're arguing over something rather trivial rather than the thing, right, that we should be discussing. All right, so that's one thing. We need focus and clarity. We need to know who we are. We need to stop letting them control the conversation. The flip side of that is I think we need to be loud and vocal about who we are. We don't necessarily need to lead by criticism so much as by example. Broad statements, clear statements of our values, of what's important. We think about a lot of environmental efforts. They often go into that category, right? We will argue and fight and make a big deal to try to recycle. I will save little things and throw them in the recycling bin, even though I know it hardly matters whether that one little bit gets thrown out. But what it is an example, right? What it is an effort to say, these are my values. I need others to see that. I need to not bend when pressured on this, because that can help move them, right? That can bring them forward. We think about critical race theory and arguing about that. Yes, they want us to use that term because what they don't want us to say, right, is what I want is racial justice. What I want to see, right, is that racist institutions, racist histories get paid attention to. I've been using the phrase the legacies of slavery a lot lately because that's part of one of the grants that I was in has that title. And I like that. I think that's a really useful way to talk about it. I am worried about the legacies of slavery. I'm not going to get into their fight about theory, right? Whether something is racist in that or if something is critical race theory or not. What I want to see are the legacies of slavery taken away. I want to see those comped for. I want to see those dealt with. We think similar things about wealth inequality. That's an incredibly wide concern. Lots of people actually share their concern about that. That's precisely why they're trying so hard to distract us, right? To get us to talk about almost anything else. Because if we start paying attention to wealth inequality, the vast majority of Americans think there's a problem. Republicans and Democrats think that there is too much control by a tiny group of people. We need to avoid the efforts to try to stereotype those people as somehow, Jews behind the scenes controlling everything or some sort of racist cabal, right? It's not that. It's wealth. It's power. It's being consolidated in the hands of just a few people. And that's not democratic. So we can, I think, tolerate an economy with some inequality. And I think that's certainly possible to have some. But if you get too much, it overrides everything. You can't have democracy. You can't have government. You can't have any other area that's not controlled by money. I think that's probably the biggest issue we're facing. I think it's one that many people agree is a problem. But I think that's why they're trying to get us to stop talking about it. So anyway, those are my ideas at the moment for what we might need to do to rise to this moment. I'm not sure that it's enough. I'm sure it's not enough. I'll say that. I'm sure it's not enough. But I'd love to hear sort of your ideas or thoughts that we might be able to add to it and think about what we can do, because I do think we're living through a particularly important historic moment.